Chapter 2.4, Sculpture. So sculptures can be made of any material, basically. I mean, it could be anything from glass to ice, plastic, chocolate. It can be made out of animals, so it could be done out of anything. Sculpture does exist in a three-dimensional world, and it occupies the physical space, so just kind of keep that in mind when we're talking about sculpture, because like I said, the vocabulary changes when we do the analysis. So there's some of the approaches that artists will take to different types of sculpture. So we have sculpture that can be freestanding. It's sculpture in the round. We can walk around it. Then we have reliefs, which basically is designed to see from one side. And so in a relief, it's either sunk into a surface or it protrudes, it pops out from the surface. So this is a freestanding sculpture, and it's designed to be seen from the front. So in the back, it's going to be flat. It's supposed to sit straight up and then against the wall. And so you can see the front of it and possibly the sides, but it's coming out and it's not something that you can walk around. With a sculpture in the round, these sculptures you can actually walk around the whole thing. So basically what this piece is, it's really retelling this ancient story about the foundation of Rome. And so most of the ancestors from Rome in the beginning, they were all male. And so they needed wives. And so what they did is that they had this festival. They invited all the Sabine women from the small town across and brought them over and then basically abducted them all. They took them and married them, right? And so it didn't matter if they were already married to somebody else. They abducted them and took them in as their own wives. And so this is how they become this kind of powerful force. And so really what the artist is using this as a political piece to tell that story. Another method of sculpture is carving. So if you think about the idea of removing something when you carve, that's why they call it subtractive method. And so basically these are pieces that are made either of like stone or ivory, wood, and you basically are just chipping and carving away, sanding and polishing. So this would be an example of a carving. So this is the Avukkara Buddha, and usually basically is holding an upright hand gesture called the Asisa Mudra. And so basically it symbolizes fearlessness and reassurance. This piece is carved from a large standing granite rock, Sri Lanka. This is Michelangelo, the Tomb of Julius II, the Tale of Moses. And so Michelangelo was a sculptor and painter, but he really believed that the finest of all arts was sculpture. And so of all the visual arts that he did, sculpture was his main love. And so even as he painted the Sistine Chapel, he was really thinking about his sculptures. So with subtractive method, you have a sculptor that's using tools to carve, drill, chisel. And so basically what the artist is doing is adding material to his final artwork. So let's look at modeling. So modeling is additive. We're adding things, working, building up to it, adding material to it. And so some of the materials that you would use for modeling would be like clay, wax. Sometimes it does require a temporary skeletal structure, like an armature. And then you also can use like clay, and then clay would be fired in a kiln, and it becomes very hard and durable. But you're modeling the sculpture. So this would be an example of one of those ceramic pieces. This is painted terracotta. And so in this sarcophagus, you see where it's actually separated into 4 different pieces. And so the reason that it's separated into 4 different pieces, it's because they have to fire it in pieces. It won't fit in a kiln. And so here you see the couple, they're relaxed, enjoying themselves, and basically just at a banquet. And so it tells us that the women actually participate in these social occasions. With casting, this is where you're adding a liquid or a pliable material to a mold. So first you'll make a model of the final sculpture, and then use that to create a mold, which is a casting and pouring in of liquids. So when that liquid is poured into the mold, then it'll harden, and then once it's hardened, they can break it out of the mold, and this will present your final original piece. So for example, here in this piece, this is the final sculpture. But it was entirely made out of wax and then casted in bronze. And so in order to do that, they created the piece in wax, and then they put a covering over that wax, and then put it in the kiln. The wax is melted out, and then basically they pour in the bronze in there. So in this diagram, you can kind of see the steps, how they would build this, right? And there is a video in this week's module so that you can see this process in action. So these were basically the principal materials of sculpture. You had plaster, ceramic, bronze, wax, marble. This was the traditional stuff. And then artists started to think about, pushing these traditional methods and really kind of becoming a little innovative and experimenting with a lot of different stuff. So artists found other ways to enliven the sculpture, to go beyond the conventional. And so even from the additive and subtractive techniques, they started doing things like construction, earthenworks, assemblages, ready-mades, kinetic artwork. This is something that moves. And installations. So as they break away from these traditions, we see how there's just a new way of thinking and new ways of making art. And so the idea that you could take Earth's surface and actually manipulate it into an art piece is kind of cool. So because of their enormous size, earthenworks really need a collaboration of many artists for this to work. And so many believe that earthenworks should be kind of the idea of representing a sense of harmony between nature and humanity. So this is the Great Serpent Mound. Prehistoric artists heaped piles of earth to sculpt this piece in the Ohio landscape. And so it really resembles a snake with its mouth open, ingesting an egg. And so the idea that this piece of earth was actually designed like this and made into a design is kind of cool. And so you see a lot of these things popping up now. With construction, this uses a variety of methods to create something. So you could have stuff like engineered materials like plastic, sheet metal. And so, there's a lot of different techniques that you can apply with construction. This is Damien Hirst, The Physical Impossibilities of Death in the Mind of Someone Living. And so this is an example of construction. Here, Damien Hirst creates this tank and then makes the construction of a tank, then fills it with formaldehyde, and then puts a dead shark in there and suspends it in formaldehyde. So that as that shark is being suspended in that tank, he's really making us kind of start to think about the idea of the contrast between life and death, right? And so it's physically impossible to understand death, right, when we're alive, basically. With assemblage, this is where an artist is practically gathering objects and putting them together to make a work and call it an assemblage, right? So you can gather any type of objects, found objects, repurposed objects, and put it together to create an art piece. This is the Liberation of Aunt Jemima. And so in this piece, Betty Saar collects a variety of found objects such as cotton, syrup labels, and the stereotypical Mammy doll. And so she kind of puts all these things together and really kind of exploring the themes of identity. And so the idea of survival of African traditions and Black cultures. And so really talking and challenging about different stereotypes. But this would be an example of assemblage, bringing various objects and putting them together. This is Edward Kienholz of the Beanery, and again, an example of where an artist collects a lot of different objects and puts them together and creates this assemblage of lots of different objects and things. A ready-made is when an artist will take something that is already made and then change it up and call it art, right? So Marcel Duchamp was one of those artists that was kind of the pioneer of this. And he was the one that kind of started this idea and started challenging us to think about these traditional ideas, to the traditional sculpture. So he believed that you could take any object and then once it's introduced to you by the artist, it can be called art. So in this piece called Fountain, what Marcel Duchamp does is basically takes this urinal from a bathroom, a men's bathroom, this is a urinal, and flips it and then calls it a fountain. So it's a ready-made, it's already a urinal, but because he took it and he changed it, flipped it, and then he calls it the fountain, it's considered art. And so we'll talk more about this piece. This is Pablo Picasso. This is Bull's Head. And so another example of a ready-made object. These are objects that are made already and then they repurpose it and take it in and make it something else. So the seat of a bicycle and the handlebars of a bicycle create this bull head. With kinetic and light sculpture, this is kinetic basically is sculpture that moves. And so with a lot of these moving sculptures, you also have lights that work with them. And so these sculptures do require like mechanical engineering. And these pieces are really creative. They're really phenomenal. Like just to see some of these things out in the real world is really fun. This is light prop for an electric stage. And so this piece moves with these like series of discs and they move in front of this light. And then so when the light changes, it influences the whole environment that you're in. Installations involve construction of a space or an assembly of objects to create an environment. The audience is encouraged to experience, so to kind of engage with the work. And so you're really getting into like this physical action and using all of your senses. This is a star fountain. And so in the movements in this one, you have these columns, these glass columns, and then the color changes over a 4-minute time span. And so the movement and the rhythm create this really beautiful installation.